Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all of you to day two of the CSTEP organized virtual discussion on the role of science and technology in society. As all of you would no doubt agree, science and technology, when properly leveraged, can play an effective role in making our world a far better place to live in. But as we also heard on day one of this event yesterday, it is in our own enlightened self interest to ensure that science is benefiting all citizens of the globe and not a select few. To deliberate more on this theme and tell us how science as a force for good can transform our very way of life, C-STEP has lined up an impressive list of speakers for this purpose today. Those who are slated to speak this evening are Dr. Arvinda Mitra, Scientific Secretary, Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor, Government of India, Chairman of EQ Investment Advisors, and also Chair of Industry Body FICCI's Environment Committee, Dr. Mukund Rajan, Ms. Uma Mahadevan, IAS, Principal Secretary, Rural Development and Panchayat Raj, Government of Karnataka, Mr. Vijay Kumar, retired IAS and currently advisor to the Government of Andhra Pradesh for Agriculture and Cooperation and co-vice chairman, Raitu Sadhikara Samstha, a company for empowering farmers set up by the government, and hopefully Mr. Anil Sardana, MD and CEO Adani Transmission, who has promised us to try his best to be here with us today. We will also have a panel discussion on the road ahead for science and technology that will see Mr. Rishikesh Patsarthi, Chief Program and Strategy Officer, Azim Premji, Philanthropic Initiatives, Dr. Veena Srinivasan, Director, Center for Social and Environmental Innovation, ACTRI, and Mr. Atul Kanwar, Chair of the Board of Kuga Energy and former President of Tech Mahindra, engage in a conversation with C-STEP Executive Director, Dr. Jay Asandi, for this purpose. Without further ado, I now formally invite Dr. Mitra to deliver his special address. But before you start, Dr. Mitra, a few words to introduce you for the audience. Dr. Mitra, after completing his master's in geology from Patna University, Dr. Mitra started his career in 1985 as a research scholar in the Department of Geology, Delhi University. In 1987, he joined the Department of Atomic Energy, Government of India, as a scientific officer and was involved in survey and exploration geology of the Himalayas. In 1988, he was awarded the Cambridge Nehru Fellowship to pursue his PhD in Earth Sciences at the University of Cambridge, UK, working on rare earth geochemistry of mid-ocean hydrothermal systems. His research work has been published in journals like Nature, Marine Chemistry, Geochemica, Cosmochemica. I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right, Dr. Mitra. It is Chemica, right? Okay. And Journal of Remote Sensing, etc. In 1993, he was appointed as Senior Scientific Officer in the Indian Antarctic Program of the Department of Ocean Development. He has to his credit the planning and launching of several multidisciplinary experiments in Antarctica. He was nominated as the Indian representative to international Antarctic treaty bodies like SCAR and COMNAP. In 1998, Dr. Mitra moved to the National Center for Polar and Ocean Research at Goa as Program Manager Science. He played a seminal role in formulating the long-term science strategy of the Antarctic mission and established the Ice Core Study Laboratory. In the course of the above assignment, Dr. Mitra has won several academic awards like the ORS Award of the UK, the Bursary Award of St. Edmund's College, Cambridge, JSPS Award of Japan, and was also elected as a Fellow of the Geological Society, London. He's been a member of the Indian Antarctic Expedition and has undertaken scientific cruises to the Indian, Atlantic, Southern Ocean, and the East Sea. In 2001, he joined as director in the Department of Science and Technology, where he proficiently enriched the scope and content of the DST-NSF cooperation. In November 2004, Dr. Mitra was confirmed as a founding executive director of the binational Indo-US Science and Technology Forum, where he was able to bring a paradigm shift in strengthening the Indo-American cooperation in science, technology, and innovation. In 2011, Dr. Mitra took over the responsibilities of advisor and head of international bilateral cooperation of the Department of Science and Technology. This job involved overseeing India's international science, technology, and innovation engagement with 44 countries across the globe and with Africa. In June 2018, Dr. Mitra was appointed as Scientific Secretary in the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India with a mandate to develop national missions in science and technology, provide synergistic policy intervention, and render periodic advice to the Prime Minister's office. We are very grateful to you, sir, for being able to join us today, and we look forward to your address. Dr. Mitra, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Somali. Thank you for a very generous but a long introduction, nevertheless. But let me first also thank CSTEP for giving me this opportunity to speak today, but a topic which cannot be more relevant than at this present moment of time. I would start by the fact that this unprecedented pandemic, I would say, has unleashed almost a new dimension to the human development crisis today. On some aspects of Human Development Index, I would say conditions are equivalent of levels of deprivation. With the gains that we had made over the last 20 years, have all gone astray. At this point of time, an astounding 110 million people have been pushed into poverty. Almost 1.6 billion children are out of school education. And the world economy has, it has triggered a loss of almost $10 trillion in the overall world economy, leading into a big recession and a job crisis globally. I would say that the pandemic was superimposed on the already existing unresolved tensions between people and technology, between people and the planet, between the haves and the have-nots. These tensions, therefore, have shaped a new dimension of inequality today, pertaining to existing capabilities and the new necessities of this century. At the same time, the response of the crisis also carries the potential to shape new strategies on how these tensions can be addressed and how inequalities in Human Development Index can be reduced. And here, I feel that the deployment of the soft prowess of science, technology, and innovation can usher a new global good, and that can provide the needs of the marginalized section of the society and citizenry. So this is something very, very important and pertinent that has come up in this COVID period and would also assume an importance in the post-COVID period. To address the present situation, therefore, a country's science, technology, and innovation policy system should enable to maintain a balance between economic, social, and environmental stability and sustainability, which is very, very critical. Building on research and experience, a new approach has to emerge, putting people in clear focus. I repeat, putting people and society in the center and as a clear focus, and emphasizing the need to work closely with rural communities and the marginalized sections of the society to support them in building on their existing strengths to improve their lives in a sustainable manner. All of you would agree that today's pressing developmental challenges are not confounded by geopolitical boundaries. Every nation has these challenges which needs to be addressed, and science, technology, and innovation therefore offers a unique opportunity to address these multifaceted challenges which are truly cross-border in nature today. Science and technology is increasingly recognized as a driver for pillar of growth, covering all sectors, starting from agriculture, nutrition, communication, cybersecurity, education, energy, health, disaster management, transport, manufacturing, you name it. Everywhere the need for science and technology is being felt every other day now. And particularly for a diverse country like India, I would say that science and technology is expected to touch the lives of people and seem to be a tool that enables the ease of living for the common man. And that is what the scientists and technologists and innovators have to address in the present context. Evidently, therefore, I would say that the span of science and technology policy interventions both in breadth and depth, has become increasingly complex. To be able to address the respective national needs and aspirations by being inclusive in the national context, and at the same time also meet the international obligations as a responsible state actor. So here a balancing act is very, very critical. The polity, therefore, today expects the adoption of science and technology policy paradigms across the value chain by involving the entire ecosystem players, including the academia, the R&D labs, the private sector enterprises, the startups, and importantly, the society. In order to unlock the potential by creating a virtuous cycle of supply and demand to feed the economy and create new jobs. Therefore, the aspirations and expectations from the scientific and technological community is now even more demanding and challenging. Scientists and technologists, therefore, cannot just remain confined within the four walls of the boundary, but they need to more proactively connect with the society, to the people, to the economy at large. And this is the changing paradigm of science and technology. How really we connect the solution science with the discovery science. You know, science with a human face is what is required at the present moment of time. And very rightly so, you know, when the UN came up in 2015, the SDG goals, as late as last year, they realized the importance of science and technology and innovation to provide enabling tools to achieve the SDG goals by 2030. And therefore, the UN Interagency Task Team created what is they call a global pilot program on science, technology, and innovation for developing the SDG roadmaps. And last year, India was actually selected as a pilot country to devise an STI roadmap that would enable achieving the SDG goals by 2030. Along with India, there are other countries, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, and Serbia, which are working on preparing this roadmap. So the global pilot program on STI for SDG is something which is inspired, therefore, by harnessing science, technology, and innovation for inclusive development, keeping in mind the needs, dreams, and aspirations of the people, particularly women, youth, and the marginalized population. Developing effective STI-enabled strategies for SDG roadmap is therefore a critical exercise that requires commitment from government and all stakeholders, including the proactive participation of the scientific and the academic community, both from the developed and developing countries. To achieve this, the premier educational and technological institutions of our country have to reorient their research ecosystem towards developing real-world solutions for the myriad challenges which are looming large in the post-pandemic period. The research outcome and new knowledge generated from our laboratories and academic institutions is expected to provide both the know-how and the show-how. And that's what I said, linking the discovery science with the solution science in an innovative way for securing food and nutrition, healthcare, education, clean environment, green energy, water security, underlined, I say once again, underlined by the driving principles of equity, inclusiveness, and affordability. So this is very, very critical. Therefore, I would say it provides a very unique opportunity to India to build on indigenous capabilities and skills for harnessing affordable, accessible, and available technologies, what I call the 3 ACEs, for achieving sustainable development goals. And this is a very unique opportunity for India, therefore, to have a new innovation paradigm put in place where people at the core is very important. At the same time, the affordability of technologies to solve their problem is another challenge. And this actually compounds the challenge to the scientific community even more. I would therefore say that of late, India's effort towards integrating science, technology, and innovation for achieving sustainable development goals have been imbibed in many of our ongoing national missions and programs. And in fact, I would like to give some examples. You know, unlike in the past, I think many of the missions are now based on knowledge convergence using technology platforms. The efforts now is to bring upfront the need of integrating scientific and technological enablers towards effective delivery of these missions to the people. And two important things that we are currently deliberating on is the new science, technology, innovation policy for India, which actually talks of a truly comprehensive, free, future-ready open science platform framework, which promises to provide access of scientific data, information, and knowledge resources to the entire ecosystem across the country. It also talks of expanding and diversifying the science, technology, innovation financing framework. It also talks of mainstreaming the grassroots innovation that I talked about, a special focus on SNT-led entrepreneurship. And most importantly, as the Prime Minister has announced, Atmanirbhar Bharat, one of the pillars of the Atmanirbhar Bharat is technology. So technology development and indigenization for Atmanirbhar Bharat is another important element of the new science technology policy. And of course, two important things that also needs to be emphasized is the enhanced thrust on science communication, which is very, very important, and the COVID has shown that. And this is very important that science be communicated in the right manner across to the society. And this is very critical as well. Just before I end, I thought I'll just quote a few examples of how India has actually reoriented its science, technology, innovation policy into a more delivery-oriented approach. Recently, the Empowered Technology Group has been created by the government, which actually has now enabled technology officers to be identified across 70 departments of the government of India. And the idea is to really infuse the scientific temper and technological tools in the performance, the internal performance of the ministries and departments, but also for delivering their own programs using the latest technological tools. And this is a new shift, a new way of thinking where science technology does not only remain confined to the so-called scientific departments and agencies that we are familiar with, but science and technology will now go across the stream in a very horizontal manner, where departments like rural development, departments like textile department, like highways department, like fertilizers, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, name it, would be now connected with the R&D ecosystem. That is, our role would be to define a research and innovation roadmap for each of the ministries and connect them across with the ecosystem. And the ecosystem consists of 5 important players, the Panchatantra, I call them: the academia, the R&D lab, the enterprises, the startup, the NGOs, the society, and of course, also the diaspora. So this is something that has started off, and now we are working with various ministries to enable that to develop. But before I end, I'll just quote some 4 or 5 very important examples how the Digital India mission, as you know, by converging the JAM, the Jandhan, Aadhaar, and Mobile, we have enabled 357 million people who were marginalized and brought them into the mainstream for empowering them economically through the digital tool. Some 350,000 common service centers have been established by the Ministry of IT, which is a network of digital kiosks, providing digital services to the citizens at affordable rates, at affordable prices. Over 14 million farmers are today linked through the CSC, to the Electronic National Agriculture Marketing, or ENAM platform. We are in the process of developing an agri-stat platform, to meet the farmer-centric needs in rural and peri-urban areas, where we are actually bringing together the enormous amount of data set that India has collected on a common platform that can then be used as an advisory to the farmer, so that he or she can use this to increase their farm output. Now this, we believe, would be a very powerful tool for sustainable agriculture practices in the remotest corner of the country. In the Jal Shakti Abhiyan, now there is a very strong technology component where we are providing a slew of technology interventions that would provide into a sustainable, water in various specific water challenge domains and areas in locations, both in terms of water quality and water quantity. In the post-pandemic period, now the National Digital Health Blueprint, which will now be enabled through the National Digital Health Portal. The vision is to integrate promotive, preventive, and curative healthcare technologies through this portal, and this will become a very important tool for delivery of healthcare across the country. I would also recall that the National Monsoon Mission, where investment, of almost 1,000 crore has led to a return of almost 5,000 crores, 50,000 crores, by touching the lives of almost 11 million below poverty line agricultural households, of which 0.53 million BPL fisher folk has been touched, and about 26% of the benefits have gone to the women folk. So the National Monsoon Mission, integrated with the high performance computing mission, has really helped in providing the weather data that has enabled a large number of farmers. And lastly, and not trivial, the National Artificial Intelligence Strategy has defined India's own brand of AI roadmap with a tagline of AI for all. I repeat, AI for all. It implies technology leadership in AI to ensure socio-economic development and inclusive growth of the country by focusing on core SDG sectors like healthcare, agriculture, education, public mobility, clean energy. Therefore, India's approach to implementation of AI and other cyber-physical systems is unique, guided by optimization of social goods rather than maximization of top-line growth, thereby ensuring job creation and not job deprivation. At this point of time, I would conclude, when inequality is the defining challenge for the mankind, we all need to think outside the box solutions to ensure that through partnerships, both at subnational, national, and international levels, we can assure equitable access to the fruits of science, technology, and innovation. And this is very critical. There is a dimension to the right to science, which can inspire the STI roadmap for SDG road programs. Thus, science with a human face, when realized in tangible outcomes by the needy and the poor, will be a proof for the key role of science and technology and development, particularly in attending the SDG goals by 2030. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mitra. We have a lot of questions from the audience. Jay, could we take a few questions for Dr. Mitra? Okay. So, Dr. Mitra, there are two questions which we had from the audience. I mean, there are several, but two came immediately to those were first on the minds of people. Just that organizations like CSTEP, which work in the areas of artificial intelligence, clean energy, all the sectors that you mentioned, and which kind of coincide with these 9 missions of the Prime Minister's Science, Technology, and Innovation Advisory Council. How do you think organizations like CSTEP and others like us can work with the Prime Minister's Science, Technology, and Innovation Advisory Council so that we can also contribute to the realization of this document?
Sure. It's a very relevant question. Now, today we realize, as I said, when I talk of an ecosystem, and the fact that science and technology and innovation has to be a very horizontal and cross-cutting, enabling tool. It is very important that scientists and technologists and policymakers really connect across the entire ecosystem. Organizations like CSTEP, I consider them as knowledge partners, in providing us perspectives both in policy dimensions as well as the ability for translation of science to touch the lives of people. The perspectives that you bring would be very different than what we get from within the government system. So it's important that think tanks like you play a very, very proactive role in this process of building this new whole system of science, technology, innovation ecosystem in the country. And what I feel the COVID has shown us, the trust and confidence in ourselves, the ability to be able to deliver what we could do during the COVID period is because of the trust and the confidence and the partnership that we built when the nations asked us to provide with solutions. And in this whole scenario, I feel collaborations is the only way forward. I am one who have been involved all throughout my life, mostly promoting international collaborations. And I do believe that complementing each other's strength is the only way that we can go ahead. And organizations like CSTEPs bring in tremendous, value to the table, a new perspective which needs to be looked into. So does industry, startups, and other enterprises. So I think you have a very important role, and especially when I alluded to, besides the PMSTAC, which you talked about, is the Empowered Technology Group, where we have to now talk and walk and hold hands with line ministries, with ministries, social development ministries, infrastructure ministries, which are directly connected with the society, with people. And therefore, and the scientific community per se is totally disconnected, honestly, to a very large extent, I would say, with the society. And I think organizations like CSTEP are more closer to the society than an academic lab or an R&D lab. And you bring a bridge between the two. So I think your role is going to be increasingly important in the coming years.
Dr. Mitra, thank you very much. Owing to the paucity of time, that means we couldn't, we had many questions for you. But so what we will do is that we'll send the questions to you, and
Sure.
we would request you that that means we follow up with your office, that if you could answer, because there's so many questions. If I read out all the questions, it will take up, I think, the entire duration of the session.
I understand.
So thank you again, Dr. Mitra, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure having you. And if you could, that means I know that you're pressed for time, but we have some of the other speakers immediately after. If you could listen in to some of them, and maybe, so we would be very grateful if you could stay on for as long as you can.
Sure. I'll hang around for some more time, maybe another 15, 20 minutes. Thank you very much, Somali. Thank you for your patience here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitra. Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Pleasure.
So that was Dr. Arvinda Mitra, ladies and gentlemen. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Mukund Rajan. So Dr. Rajan, many of you would already be aware of him, but in any case, a few words about you, Dr. Rajan, for the benefit of the audience. So Dr. Rajan is an alumnus of the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. I think all your brothers also went to IIT Delhi, Dr. Rajan, didn't they? That means
yes,
you both brothers, right? Okay, so Dr. Rajan kind of followed the trend. Okay, so and then he completed. So Dr. Rajan completed his master's and doctorate in international relations from Oxford University. He's been a distinguished corporate leader. He's held innumerable senior positions at the Tata Group, including being the brand custodian, member of the Group Executive Council, advising the Group Chairman at Tata Sons. And what was which sometimes is not very talked about, is that in 2007, the World Economic Forum had honored him as a young global leader, which is a great achievement. So currently, Dr. Rajan is chairing EQ Investment Advisors, which focuses on environment, social, and governance issues. So, which is a topic of great interest and coincides with these SDGs and other things that Dr. Mitra was talking about. So, may I now invite Dr. Rajan to deliver his address. Dr. Rajan, over to
Thank you so much. Thank you, Somali. I just want to check that the audio is clear. You can hear me fine?
Yeah, I can hear you. We can hear you.
Lovely. Okay, great. So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to address you all. It's a real pleasure to participate in this discussion series on the role of science and technology in society. What I'm going to do is, over the next 12 minutes, really share some perspectives on the impact of the new focus on ESG, or environment, social, and governance, on corporate India. As most of you would be aware, the E in ESG encapsulates the natural resources a business consumes, the pollution it creates, the carbon emissions it generates, and many other environmental impacts. The S refers to the links and ties a business develops with the local community, the way it treats its own people, its focus on diversity and inclusion, and its reputation as a trusted partner to stakeholders. And the G deals with how a business is governed, including board effectiveness protocols, audit controls, the approach to senior executive compensation, and appropriate reliance on independent directors. These ESG issues critically influence the sustainability of businesses. And there has been an upsurge in interest in ESG during the current pandemic, which has severely tested the resilience of Indian companies. Stakeholders are likely to be less forgiving the next time around if businesses find themselves unprepared. So let me cover the broad context, both domestic and international, in which an ESG focus is becoming important for corporate India. And then I will outline what Indian businesses might do to respond to stakeholder expectations. My starting point, unfortunately, is that there is considerable skepticism that many stakeholders have about the capabilities of many Indian companies to build sustainable, profitable businesses. We point, for instance, to India's corporate governance crisis, reflected in the volume of cases brought under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the National Company Law Tribunal, over 10,000 and counting, and the linked impact on the rising non-performing assets in the Indian banking system, a big reason for India's economic underperformance. We are also in the midst of an environmental crisis. The economic activity of corporate India has unfortunately yielded some of the worst environmental indicators in the world. These include 21 of the 30 most polluted cities in the world in terms of air pollution being in India, just under half of India's landmass undergoing some form of degradation, and 21 of India's largest cities projected to run out of groundwater by next year, according to the Niti Aayog. Rising environmental concerns in India also mirror growing concerns around the world about global environmental issues. Most pressing of these currently is global warming-induced climate change. India is in fact key to how the world will resolve the problem of global warming. It is already the third largest greenhouse gas producer in the world after China and the United States, and on an incremental basis, during this decade, may well add the largest stock of greenhouse gases in the world. Global environmental issues in some ways really reflect the huge interconnectedness of the world that we now live in. And this is an interconnectedness that has been steadily growing in recent decades. It's been aided by the explosion of international trade over the last 25 years, ever since the creation of the World Trade Organization, the growth in international travel, and certainly the advent of the World Wide Web. Thanks to such international interconnectedness, multiple stakeholders beyond domestic borders are now capable of influencing the domestic agenda of corporate India. On an issue like climate change, for instance, I think we should expect that foreign governments, besides introducing new rules and regulations, will also start pushing the envelope on tariff and non-tariff trade barriers, as well as constraints on international aid to push Indian companies to improve their environmental compliance. Meanwhile, customers across the globe are increasingly demonstrating a preference to embrace brands that have a societal purpose and that show empathy for the challenges local communities may face. Global stakeholder concerns are also often mediated through the instrument of the United Nations. And we just heard the Secretary mention the UN SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. These SDGs have essentially fused the global with the local and created an interest of the international community in the way in which local environmental and social issues are now being addressed within countries. And in sync with this broad, evolving international context in which ESG issues are now becoming top of mind, over $80 trillion, that's trillion with a T, of invested funds around the world have subscribed to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, or the UNPRI. Excuse me. These principles really require the investors who subscribe to them to incorporate ESG issues into their investment analysis and decision-making processes, and to seek appropriate disclosure on ESG issues by the entities in which they invest. And disclosure is going to become very important for corporate India. The European Commission has meanwhile put out regulations that require all asset managers in the European Union to disclose the ESG performance of their investment portfolios. And these, as we know, include many Indian companies. On ESG issues like global warming, in fact, such investors are making critical decisions to divest the stocks of companies that contribute to such problems. And it is likely that the United States, under a pro-climate Biden administration, may follow the European Union's lead. From the perspective of lenders too, there is an increasing thrust on reporting of material climate-related risks by businesses in their financial filings, and this is in accordance with the recommendations made by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So in a sense, capital, both as equity and as debt, will increasingly be allocated in the future towards well-governed companies that contribute to the goals of a more sustainable economy and society. The impact of these evolving domestic and international expectations is reflected to some extent in the evolution of domestic regulation that governs corporate India's sustainability focus. So from the voluntary guidelines on corporate social responsibility that were first issued in 2009 in India, to the more recent national guidelines on responsible business conduct issued by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in 2019, or from the business responsibility report that was first mandated by SEBI for the top 100 listed companies in 2012, to the new business responsibility and sustainability report template that is being prepared this year and is going to be mandated for the top 1,000 listed companies, there has been considerable movement in pushing the envelope in India. Regulations with a significant focus on good governance are also increasingly influencing the conduct of Indian corporates. So these include important minority shareholder protection rights embedded in the 2013 amendments to the Indian Companies Act, as a result of which, incidentally, India has in fact been rated amongst the best countries in the world in terms of shareholder rights protection in the World Bank's Doing Business 2020 report. And keeping Indian corporates on their toes are a clutch of different stakeholder groups, including proxy advisory firms and activist funds that are pressing for more purposive action by Indian businesses. And parallelly, stewardship codes have also been put out by the various regulators, including SEBI, the IRDAI, and PFRDA, for the institutional investors that they oversee, including mutual funds, insurance companies, and the pension funds. If these investors live up to their stewardship responsibility to enhance monitoring and engagement with their investee companies, I think this will also be very impactful in leading to improved ESG performance in corporate India. So, to deliver such improved ESG performance, what might be the key focus areas for corporate India? Now, these will certainly vary from company to company, but I would suggest that the following are going to be critically important. Top of the list, clearly, will have to be good governance. The boards of Indian companies must ensure their board composition reflects the industry experience they require, with an appropriate complement of qualified and capable independent directors, and they must invest in the continuous education of these directors. They must also ensure that the companies have well-running sustainability functions with proper board oversight. Another issue that is high on my personal priority list for embracing an ESG agenda is the adoption of a code of conduct and the nurturing of an ethical culture. Ideally, a code should speak to and be supportive of the vision, mission, and values of a company and the kind of organizational culture its leadership wishes to build. The next issue Indian companies need to pay attention to is resource use efficiency and embracing circular economy practices that minimize waste across the product life cycle. This is also incidentally throwing up many new opportunities for Indian companies. And you see this across segments like energy optimization, electric vehicles, the Internet of Things, and the sharing economy. To secure better ESG performance, Indian companies would be well advised to link this to executive compensation. Global leaders like Pepsi, Walmart, Microsoft, and Shell are doing exactly this by linking compensation to targets on critical ESG issues like carbon emission reduction and improving workforce diversity. Diversity is a critical issue for Indian companies as well. I think we need to establish far greater diversity within our workforces. And there are two specific areas of focus that I would want to call out. One is gender, where India as a nation has one of the lowest levels of female participation in the workforce anywhere in the world. The second area of diversity failure is the poor absorption of representatives of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities in Indian workforces. And at a broader level, corporate India also has to focus on employee engagement, where many Indian companies tend to score very poorly. A number of Gallup and other studies have shown the strong correlation between a focus on employee engagement and better customer engagement, higher productivity, better retention, fewer accidents, better health outcomes, and higher profitability. Most critically, and this is, I think, one big reason I think this kind of discussion that CSTEP is organizing is so critical. Most critically, I think in preparing for the transition to an ESG-friendly world, corporate India will have to improve its record of risk-taking and innovation. So according to last year's economic survey of the Ministry of Finance, the national gross expenditure on R&D in science and technology as a percentage share of the Indian GDP has been stagnant at 0.6% to 0.7% for over 2 decades. And this is far lower compared to other BRIC nations. And China in particular, with which we often benchmark ourselves, is spending 2.1%, and that too on a far larger GDP base. Developed countries like Japan at 3.2%, Germany at 3%, and the United States at 2.8% also spend much more than we do. So this is, in some ways, I think currently at least, Indian industry's Achilles heel. But hopefully through dialogues like this one and the efforts of entities like CSTEP, this will change in the future. So that's a very quick and very broad perspective on the changing landscape and how ESG is impacting corporate India. So thank you so much for your time. Back to you, Somali.
Dr. Rajat, thank you very much. That means that you put it very succinctly, the whole thing about corporate India and the ESG. I know it's a broad topic and go on and on about this. But two quick questions. One is about how do you think organizations like CSTEP can work with businesses and Indian industry to improve the whole thing, the ESG thing? I know that regulation can only go so far. Okay, you regulate, then there'll be people will find ways to not do things, and you bring in a fresh set of regulations. It just goes on and on and on. There's no end to it. And so first question is, how do you think organizations like CSTEP can work with businesses to ensure that you are actually strengthening the CSD ecosystem in the country? And secondly, about this whole issue about stakeholder capitalism. There's so much of talk about stakeholder capitalism. Now everyone's talking stakeholder capitalism. I think it's increased post-COVID. So do you think that our companies are actually walking the talk on stakeholder capitalism, or it's just something that because it's a nice thing to say, so they say it, and because they have to bring out these sustainability reports, they bring out very nicely. That means those reports read very nice, but are they really walking the talk? That means I know there are some groups, the group with which you are associated, of course, I would say that's an exception. It's always been an exception to the rule. So you're not, that means they've always lived up to the highest standards of corporate governance and stakeholder capitalism and all that. So, but the vast majority of Indian companies, are they really walking the talk on?
So let me start with the second question first. I think the CSR legislation, for instance, is a good evidence point of how corporate India is responding to some of this pressure to do more to create a more benign perspective of capitalism in this country, perhaps. And I think to a significant measure, the CSR legislation actually worked. When it was first introduced, a lot of corporates opposed it, saying this is just an additional tax on corporate India. But in fact, I think what we've seen happening certainly in the Tata Group, in many of our listed companies, but also in other corporates that I used to discuss this with, I think the fact that you elevated the discourse on CSR to the level of the board, because the legislation made it incumbent on companies to actually create a committee of the board which had an independent director on it. I think that elevated the discourse on CSR. In fact, some of our companies went further than and rechristened the CSR committee as a sustainability committee of the board. So I think some of these are trends where more and more people are embracing them and then seeing the value. So if I come to the issue of ESG more generally, I think the value it is demonstrating for companies, and which is the reason why very hard-nosed investors are also embracing this. The CEO of the world's largest money manager, BlackRock, Larry Fink, has now made a name for himself through his annual letters to CEOs every year, which now rival Warren Buffett's annual shareholder statements in the popularity, where he talks about ESG, he talks about corporate purpose, he talks about a new form of capitalism. But actually, at its core, what ESG and an ESG focus is doing is actually preparing companies to deal with risk better. And in that sense, it's actually just a way of de-risking your business. If you have a business that works well with the community, that doesn't spoil the environment, is not likely to get taxed by the government because of mishaps that may take place, is not going to get sued by some class of shareholder, obviously it's good for the corporation. So I think to cut a long story short, the essence of this is preparing yourself better to deal with potential risk. And that is something any hard-nosed investor will recognize and respect. It doesn't suddenly mean that you've changed and become a much more philosophical or spiritual corporate person. It just means that you're adapting to the changing environment much better. Your first question on the role that CSTEP and organizations like CSTEP can play, I think critically for India, too much of our, too large a proportion of our business community is not necessarily exposed to the latest trends overseas. And that's the point I made about an issue like climate change. I think, given the kind of existential crisis it could pose to many countries, including small island nations, the extreme weather events you're seeing around the world, a number of developed country governments are going to be incentivized to punish countries and companies in those countries that don't respond well with an objective of improving their climate friendly practices and processes. So India may be at the receiving end of this. So we need to prepare better for some of these challenges. Also, if we can convert some of these into opportunities, there's no reason why India, with the largest two-wheeler manufacturer base in the world, cannot become the world leader in electric two-wheelers. You remember 2 years back when the Niti Aayog proposed that by 2025 we migrate fully to electric vehicles, there was a huge pushback from industry. And I think in the process we lost an opportunity to emerge as a world leader in the space. So some of these issues we'll have to take tough stands. We'll have to look at opportunities, but equally we'll have to look at what it means for our country. And I think organizations like CSTEP, which are looking at the policy dimension as much as the science and the technology that goes into this, are very well positioned to create that bridge and ensure that we can evolve into the future in a way that makes sense for our country, but protects our interests as well.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Dr. Rajan, for your time. And we had several questions for you. So what we will do is we'll share those questions with you, and we will request you to, that means to kindly find the time to respond to those, because there's so many questions. That means those are the questions I asked you, just because questions came to my mind. So we have many questions for you, and we share those questions with you. But once again, thank you very much for sparing the time to be with us here today.
Thank you for having me.
And we look forward to having you at more such events in future. Okay? Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
So that was Dr. Mukund Govind Rajan, gentlemen. And now, following Dr. Rajan, we'll have a series of thematic sessions. The first thematic session which we are going to have is on digital technologies and works for both. And for that, I'll request my colleague, Mr. Ashish Srivastava, to kindly engage in this conversation with Mr. Uma Mahadevan, IAS, Principal Secretary for Rural Development in Panchayat Raj, Department Government of Karnataka. So over to you, Ashish.
Many thanks, Somali. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all to this first of the thematic sessions, the topic for which is implementing digital technology for social good. Now, I'm not going to repeat a lot of messages, which actually was very well covered in the first session today by Dr. Arvind Mitra, that how much more the science and technology still has to reach in terms of addressing the needs of marginalized communities and remote communities. And there can't be a better person to talk about it than the guest that we have today, who has grappled with the policy issues, grappled with the grassroots problems. And I will right away like to introduce to you our guest for today to lend her perspectives on this, Ms. Uma Mahadevan. As Somali has mentioned, she is the Principal Secretary of Rural Development in Panchayat Raj in the Government of Karnataka. In her career, she has served various capacities at both the center and the state. She has been in departments of agriculture, education, health and family welfare, women and child development, and she has also served in the Department of Atomic Energy for the and the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. She is known for her relentless passion for social welfare. She was an active member of the working group which first prepared the Human Development Report. She is a very active author, and her articles keep on coming in various respected journals and news magazines. So, welcome to this first of the session, Ms. Mahadevan. And the way we will want to go about it is that if you can first share your perspective in terms of what you feel does it take to implement a technology solution or a digital solution of any kind for the social welfare, for the marginalized community, your perspective, your experiences, and then we can take the discussion from there, if that is okay.
Thank you, Ashish, for that, for the kind words and that introduction. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm happy that CSTEP has been working on organizing this important discussion. I will basically speak about three things in the course of a few minutes. I'll keep my presentation very short. I will talk about how we evolved and developed a particular application to solve problems in one particular sector, taking the example of a solution which was meant to track child nutrition, child malnutrition, and mother and child nutrition status in when I was in Women and Child Development Department. I'll also talk about how technology can be used to perhaps we can start thinking about using technology to improve governance at the local level, in local governance. That's my current role as Principal Secretary in Panchayat Raj. And the third, in my third part of my talk, I will talk a little bit about why technology should follow policy rather than the other way around, using the example of the Gram Panchayats and the COVID pandemic, the work that was happening in the COVID pandemic. So at the outset itself, I'd like to say that in social welfare programs, although we have started using technology to some extent, the first thing that we need to remember, which we say but we don't understand deeply enough, is that technology is not a panacea for the problems of the sector. So we should enter with that thought in mind. The second thing we need to keep in mind is that technology is an instrument which does what we use it to do. But it's also important to understand the potential of technology to help us to solve certain intractable problems in social welfare. And that's what takes me to the first example that I'll be talking about, which is a solution, an application called Sneha, Solution for Nutrition and Effective Health Access. That's the acronym, which was developed as the result of a requirement in the Women and Child Development Department first. Thereafter, when we found that Health Department also in Karnataka needed certain functionalities which could be easily brought into SNEHA, and thereafter was also used for nutrition rehabilitation centers in Karnataka as the discussions evolved. SNEHA was a solution. We didn't even have the name right at the beginning. We just thought about the work of the Anganwadi worker. Let me backtrack a little bit and tell you very briefly what an Anganwadi worker does. So Karnataka is like other states in India. Karnataka has what is called the Anganwadi Center, 66,000 Anganwadi centers, which are really universal childcare centers, which India has had under the ICDS program, the Integrated Child Development Scheme program, for the past several decades, starting in 1975. Today, across India, the program covers 14 lakh, nearly 14 lakh Anganwadis, covers something like 28 lakh Anganwadi workers who are educators, early childhood educators, and Anganwadi helpers who do the work of cooking and providing food to the children and to the pregnant women and so on, helping them to learn basic skills like washing up and so on and so forth. And of course, these Anganwadi centers are scattered across the country, typically in every village, in many places in habitations, largely rural program. So Anganwadis perform several functions under the ICDS scheme. They have 6 functions. One is, of course, the early childhood supplementary nutrition. They also have the function of early childhood informal education, early childhood education. They have the function of universal immunization for children and for mothers. They also take care of nutrition education. They take care of antenatal checks for the mothers and supplementary nutrition for pregnant women and breastfeeding mothers as well. So to take the example of Karnataka, we have 66,000 Anganwadi centers and n number of services provided by the Anganwadis, because over and above the ICDS scheme, Karnataka has, every state has its own schemes for which Anganwadi workers provide some kind of a mobilization or convergent or coordinating role, such as the Bhagyalakshmi scheme for girl children, the Sri Shakti scheme for women self-help groups, and so on and so forth. So the Anganwadi worker has a multiplicity of demands on her time. She has a multiplicity of registers and formats to fill up. She has a multiplicity of programs to attend to, and several functions that she needs to take care of. She also has to fill out, until recently, she had to fill out these registers physically. There was a lot of drudgery involved in her work, in addition to dealing with something like 15 to 20 children through the day from 9:30 to 4. She also has to deal with the nutritional and other requirements of pregnant women, of breastfeeding mothers, and so forth. And she has to keep in mind which child is severely malnourished, which child is moderately malnourished, which child requires a health checkup, so on and so forth. So to cater to all these, we had a discussion with CSTEP, as it happens, to see whether there could be any solution using technology to, first of all, reduce the drudgery of the Anganwadi workers' work. There was a lot of repetitive work, and we found that if she was writing 11 registers, perhaps those registers could all be collapsed into 3 or 4 basic registers. So it started off with a very simple, simply defined kind of a task. But as we started getting into it, and as CSTEP started talking to us, we started brainstorming with frontline workers, with users, with stakeholders. And as we started visiting several Anganwadis to understand the processes, we realized that this was a larger task and that several more things could be accomplished if we did this in a systematic and complex way. For example, at the end of several months, we took a holistic view, saying that the smartphone for the Anganwadi worker should do everything that the smartphone is capable of out of her entire set of works. And the human being should be free to do all the caregiving and counseling work that only a human being can. This was the second ask. The third was that nutrition typically is not a 1-day problem or a 15-day problem. It doesn't have a silver bullet, but constant tracking, constant monitoring of progress, constantly checking up after 6 months whether a child who has come out of severe malnutrition whether that child, he or she, has gone back into severe malnutrition is an important part of the Anganwadi workers' work. And therefore, tracking the progress is also an important aspect of what the solution should do. Putting it all together, we found that what we were arriving at was a solution to two problems, not of inclusion, because inclusion is something that technology and government departments have been using quite regularly and quite strongly to address the problem of inclusion errors. But what needed to be the two intractable problems that this solution could actually evolve to help us with were, one, the problem of convergence. It's quite cliched and quite well known and acknowledged that government departments work in silos. But the fact is that they have to work in the way they are structured, because otherwise you'd be creating really huge bloated bureaucracies, which it's impossible for any one set of leadership to really guide in a nimble and agile way. However, what we need is convergent action on the ground. And therefore, if we could evolve a common platform which the Anganwadi worker as well as the frontline health worker, ASHA worker, and the ANM, the nurse, and the Anganwadi supervisor, the four of them could use without replication of data, with an open-ended approach, so that on the ground, if they found any women who were excluded, they could also be added. Then you were tackling two of the most intractable problems of social welfare services, which are, one, the need for convergent action, and two, the need to address the problem of exclusion. Because exclusion is a problem where people are invisible to those who make policy, but exclusion is a problem that can be addressed only on the ground. And therefore, it's very important that the frontline workers who are using any technology solution are able to address exclusion then and there without replication. So this was the ask, and that's how Sneha evolved. It's a very exciting application, which now has grown beyond a very tiny pilot with a lot of ethnographic and observational work and a lot of process improvements on the ground. So process improvements as well as technology adaptation happened more or less in sync with each other. Thereafter, to an entire district, another district asked for it. So the adoption also grew with demand. Because Sneha was clearly showing us not only efficiency gains are very important for resource constrained governments, but also equity gains, which are probably even more important, because equity gains in terms of addressing exclusion, addressing the problem of circular migrants, of women who get left out, of children who are often dropping off the map. These are important gains for any social welfare program. So that is Sneha. The second thing I want to talk about is a platform that we're currently designing for my current role, which is in the Panchayat Raj sector. So Karnataka has 6,000 gram panchayats across the state, each one catering to a population of about 8,000 to 10,000. We do have a simple accounting software, accounting application, double entry accounting application called Panchatantra, which was designed several years ago and is in use, but it's not real time. We have several, through the RDPR department, we have several different logins and passwords. We don't have a single sign-on, many issues with this. And therefore, we decided that we needed to do a version of Panchatantra, which would be Panchatantra 2.0. And here, we would use it not only for the traditional tasks of planning of works progress review, and payments, which itself is a big thing, and Karnataka is already doing that using the Government of India's platform, which is on PFMS. It's called eGram Swaraj. We are 100% on eGram Swaraj. We were the first state to come there. But in addition, in Karnataka, in Panchatantra, could we start addressing some of the problems such as of improving governance? How do we improve governance? So I'm looking at very specific positive actions and strengthening processes on the ground. For example, meeting management. it's important for panchayats to have that meeting of the general body every month. It's important for them to start with last month's meeting decisions and what are the follow-up actions taken on it. It's important to end every meeting with the next month's meeting date. It's also important for the panchayats have something like 12 subcommittees, the Anganwadi committee, the village health committee, the village school development committee. All these committees have been made subcommittees of the panchayat. Now, the subcommittees of the panchayat meet every month. When they meet, they identify points of convergence. There are points where there is special need to address a certain problem, localized problems, things and so on. So typically in a panchayat, you will have not one Anganwadi committee, you may have 10 Anganwadi committees. Now, technology is the only way in which the decisions taken by the Anganwadi committees, the subcommittees, can automatically come to the notice of the Panchayat Standing Committee on Social Justice, be discussed there, a recommendation be made or solutions be found, and thereafter be brought to the general body of the Panchayat for a decision and maybe a financial allocation. At the end of 6 months, when the Panchayat is presenting its report card to the Gram Sabha, which is the assembly of every voter in the panchayat, we are thinking of even taking these decisions forward and using the very powerful tool of data visualization to present data and the report of working of the panchayats in easily comprehensible, not bar charts and pie charts, but easily comprehensible visualizations to the Gram Sabha, many of whom may be either illiterate or semi-literate, but they also need to be informed, because we feel that not only administrative and political decentralization, but information decentralization is the only way to deepen democracy and strengthen local democracy. We're also thinking of using, for example, text-to-speech software to read out decisions of the panchayats, so that members who may be illiterate or semi-literate can understand what's going on, understand better what's going on, and also to put as much data in the public domain as possible, where people can sign on through a mobile application. They can get data of their panchayat. All very doable, very not very difficult to do at all, but can have tremendous impact on the working of the local governments. The third thing I wanted to talk about is really a kind of a caution, a word of caution at this point, that, as I said, technology is no panacea, and technology should always follow policy, because policy needs to dictate the design and the structure, the architecture of whatever technological solution is being planned. Once that's done with a certain integrity and a certain openness of discussion and consultations with stakeholders, then the problems with technology, you know, the problems of misuse of technology, of privacy violations, of surveillance, and so on, will automatically be part of that discussion whenever there is a deep stakeholder discussion about the use of technology. So I wanted to talk about the work of the Gram Panchayats during the COVID pandemic and just explain to you how we use technology to strengthen that working. We have 6,000, as I said, 6,000 Gram Panchayats. And in March itself, what we did was that 6,000 Gram Panchayats with something like 90,000 members. In March itself, as soon as we, COVID had been declared a pandemic, we were taking steps to strengthen the vigil in rural areas and so on. We issued enabling orders setting up the Gram Panchayat task forces. So as I said, convergence is an important aspect of social welfare programs on the ground. Task force is a platform for convergence. It's a human platform, because it brings together the elected members of the Gram Panchayat, the staff of the Gram Panchayat, as well as the frontline officials of different sectors, such as the Anganwadi worker, the Asha worker, the health officer, the village accountant from the revenue department, the police, the sub-inspector, and so on and so forth, even the bank manager if there's a bank branch, and the banking correspondent, the village multi-purpose rehabilitation worker, and so on. What this task force did was actually, one, its responsibilities were science-based dissemination of awareness about COVID, so that people knew what the virus, this was in March this year, so that people knew exactly what a virus was, how it spread, what precautions they should take, because that would empower people. And then using this information, using folk techniques as well as local, microphones on auto rickshaws and so on, to inform everybody using public announcements to take precautions. Because in the gram panchayat, you will have, in rural areas, you have the milk cooperative where people have to take their milk every day. You have the water purification plant where people go to collect water, purified drinking water. You have the water bodies, because this was in the middle of the festival. People go in the hot season, there are children swimming, so on. Everywhere we said social distancing and follow precautions, hand wash. This was the first thing. The second thing they did was, during lockdown and for the supply of essential commodities, the Panchayat Task Force took certain steps. The third thing was on regular supply of meal supplementation, Anganwadi rations, school rations to doorsteps of children and beneficiaries. And the fourth and most important thing was actually to manage the COVID response, including the health response, as well as the migrants and the shelter for relief for those in need. You'll be surprised to know that Gram Panchayats in Karnataka ran as many as 12,800 institutional quarantines, took care of 4 lakh migrants who came back to the panchayats from other states and other districts, took care of a lot of shelter needs, shelter, food, even clothing in many places, gave them MGNREGA job cards. This was possible not only through an executive order. We issued the orders, but we immediately followed it up the next day with online training using YouTube Live. And this was truly, it's been the most eye-opening, one of the most eye-opening experiences for me, is that the professionalism and the diligence and the attentiveness with which all our panchayat members, all our frontline staff attended these trainings. We conducted several rounds of training, one for general dissemination, one for lockdown measures, one for COVID management, one for relief measures, another one for institutional quarantine. All of these, if we said, the program starts at 11, they'd be sitting there in front of their computers at 10:45. They would participate. The questions would be deeply thoughtful, very attentive, and action on the ground would be immediate and also would follow protocols. So it's my hypothesis that that a lot of stigmatization and a lot of dysfunctionality that could have otherwise happened in rural areas due to information asymmetry was actually prevented due to the good work on the ground of panchayat task forces. Convergent work, but also work that was assisted and guided from day one using at-scale training and orientation, which enabled them to have the skills to take forward this. To sum up, I wanted to say that technology, A, is not a panacea. However, it is very powerful. The powerful features of technology should be used in ways that not only address the problem of inclusion, but address the problem of exclusion. And that's a challenge we should constantly throw to ourselves. It should also help us to achieve convergent action. Without convergent action and without addressing exclusion, technology will not be performing to the extent that it can. And it's possible because we've done with Sneha, we are now doing with the work with Panchatantra 2, we've worked with online training for panchayats. It's completely possible to use technology in an imaginative and creative and empowering way, rather than only in a narrow and rigid, what I call for want of a better word, a technocratic way. I also think that technology should follow policy, but it should follow policy very closely. And therefore, the process of designing digital solutions should itself be a process of understanding whether your processes which are on the ground are the best possible, or whether you can bring any improvements in them. So that conversation should keep happening. And my final word on this is that the conversation should keep happening. It should not be an insular conversation. It should be not only in consultation with field workers and frontline officers, it should also be in consultation with other stakeholders, including the most vulnerable of the general public, because that's the only way we'll realize that what we're going ahead and doing, whether it's constructive or whether it's creating problems for some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Thanks very much. That's what I had to say. Open to any questions that you may have.
Many thanks, Suma. That was a wonderful perspective that you gave on various initiatives. And I think we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. In fact, Dr. Atre, one of our very respected mentors and advisors, he wanted to ask a question personally to you. Neha, if it's possible, can we ask Dr. Atre to do that?
Okay. The point is that how much of this has specifically to do with technology itself or the implementation of the technology? You identified several of the issues, and what is not the. Is it a failure of the implementation, or is the technology shortcoming? But I agree, technology is not a panacea. But on the other hand, what is that we should do to improve the situation which you have brought out? Was not clear to me.
Yes, thank you for that question. How much of it is to do with the technology itself and how much of it with implementation? So I think in social welfare services, we are actually using the technology as an instrument. And therefore, we are using the technology itself becomes a partner in the implementation and in the rollout. And therefore, the technology by itself is a static thing, right? But it's about how we use it to implement the processes that we need that actually activates it for use in the social welfare services. I suppose Ashish will be able to explain it better using the example of Sneha, if that's part of your session today or maybe on a later date. Using the very concrete example of Sneha, the rollout of Sneha, we can show how technology can either do the relatively static work of transforming the Anganwadi workers' 11 registers and bringing them onto a phone, or can it do something more by identifying which of those children require attention on a day-to-day basis, which of those children are repeatedly ill, which of those children perhaps have a problem of drinking water in their area or sanitation in their area, so many other creative things. So I think the use of the technology along with the implementation, they have to go hand in hand. I'm not sure if I've clearly answered your question, but I think it can only be answered with a concrete example. Back to you, Ashish.
Yeah, thanks, Uma. I think I will not start speaking on Sneha right now because that will eat up all the time. But I will definitely answer, give the details later on to Dr. Atre. There's one question, because we are running out of time already, is from the audience, and if you can give a very brief, because so somebody has asked that while the last mile of reaching Anganwadi is Asha ANMs have been reached, but how in your current role you are bringing the citizens and the community and the women, how that voice you are integrating into your technology, and whether it's Panchtantra or something, how you are bringing that all together? Is there some focus on that?
Yes, good question. Thanks for that. So one of the things that we're doing in Panchtantra, there are two things. One is under right to education, right to information, there's already proactive disclosure. And we are proposing to put a lot of our data, which is not violative of privacy and so on, into the public domain, and making it possible, putting it in public domain, possible in ways which are accessible easily to the public in any panchayat. This is one. The second thing is that a lot of the data that we're collecting for the use of Panchatantra and for the use of panchayats is usually collected by staff. We are going ahead now and expanding on this and saying that all data, all surveys that we're doing, unless it's not possible to do so or for some specific reason cannot be done, all data should be collected in a participatory way. So there will be, for example, very shortly we are rolling out a house-to-house children's survey in Karnataka statewide. through all panchayats, all children 0 to 18 will be surveyed and enumerated for the sake of immunization, health services, Anganwadi services, and school enrollments. Now, this survey is being done by a team of surveyors where there will be a panchayat staffer, there will be a Anganwadi worker, and there will also be one of the local women who are members of the self-help group, so that she's a parent, she's a stakeholder, and she will have a greater understanding of local areas where children may be out of school or may not be covered under Anganwadi services, so on and so forth. So that is the second thing. The third thing that we're doing is Mygov India is a citizen interface platform which has been created in Government of India. We are now planning to have a Mygov India version for every panchayat, which will bring a citizen interface, which will enable citizens to interface with the panchayat to raise their issues and have discussions. It will also, of course, link up with the social media handles of every panchayat. We also have several services which are provided by panchayats, including property assessments and trade licenses, building licenses, have all been brought online very recently. So online services also is another way of providing services and access to citizens across the panchayat. So these are some of the things, but the most important and powerful tool I still feel is going to be the data visualization, which will be at the Gram Sabha level. I think that really can be a game changer. I hesitate to use that word because it's something that is used very easily and loosely, but I really think that will have the potential to inform the public in ways that hasn't been done before.
Many thanks, ma'am. I think we have exceeded the time by a lot, but it was a fantastic answer. Thanks a lot for being part of this discussion. I think audience have gained a lot. Welcome and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Madhavan, Ashish. So we now move on to the second in the series of thematic discussions, which would be on climate adaptation and mitigation. And for that, so I would request my colleague Indu to take over. Indu, please.
Thank you, Somali. Thank you for that. Very good evening to everyone who is here. I'm very happy to be with you people, although it's on a virtual platform. So the thematic session, as you all know, is about climate change. Now, first and foremost, I think we need to recognize that India is already grappling with multiple challenges, and it's at an important juncture in its development trajectory. Now, the issue of climate change is something that's manifesting more and more as extreme events, as floods and droughts. And even this year, 2020, has been a year of extremes, with a fifth of India's districts experiencing drought-like conditions. Around the end of August 2020, this was what was reported. And while at the same time, a large part of rest of India was negotiating or fighting floods. So if India is to successfully tackle climate change, both in terms of what we call as mitigation, which is nothing but reducing emissions, and coping with some level of change that's bound to happen, which is adaptation, it will need to address complex, intertwined challenges. So what better sector to understand these linkages and challenges than agriculture? And who better than someone who's spearheading a climate resilient zero budget natural farming program in Andhra Pradesh? I am pleased to introduce Mr. Vijay Kumar, a retired IAS officer serving as advisor to the government of Andhra Pradesh, Agriculture and Cooperation, and co-vice chairman of Raitu Sadhikara Samstha, a farmers empowerment company set up by the Andhra Pradesh state government. He has also been, as recently as a couple of days ago, been invited to be the vice chair production in the UN Food Systems Champions Network. Mr. Vijay Kumar unfortunately could not join us here today, but we do have a recording of him sharing his insights on climate change, agriculture, and the innovative program that he leads, the zero budget natural farming. So can we have the video now, please?
Evening, distinguished panelists and guests. I'm sorry I'm not present today because of other engagements. I'm very thankful to CSTEP for this invitation. I'll be talking about the impact of climate change on agriculture and livelihoods. I'm heading a program in Andhra Pradesh, which is called the AP Community Managed Natural Farming, and I will, talk to you based on our experiences in this program. First of all, there are multiple emergencies as far as agriculture livelihoods and consumers are concerned, and climate change. So these are all interrelated. You have farmers' distress, which is increasing year after year, mainly on account of ever increasing costs of cultivation, declining soil fertility, weather uncertainties, market uncertainties. And then you have the problem with the consumers. The food that you're eating is not safe. It also lacks essential nutrients, and there's also a possibility of food scarcity. And then you have the environmental crisis, where there is a continuous soil degradation. We are losing soil organic matter. Extreme weather events are intensifying, greater frequency of these events, and there is a water emergency. There is global warming, decreased biodiversity, water pollution, air pollution. So there are multiple emergencies which we're all facing, and so that's a very serious problem. And but this is the thing that I want to mention, that the way we are doing agriculture, the way we are managing the food system itself is causing climate change. So both food systems are victims of climate change. At the same time, the food system, agriculture, livelihoods themselves are causing climate change. And that is, I think, a very serious matter. And we are losing topsoil, we are losing soil organic matter, and all this is going as CO2. So, because of deforestation, forest fires, burning crop residues, ploughing, keeping lands fallow, overgrazing, excess irrigation, wind and water erosion, and for the last 70 years, use of biocides, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, weedicides. So all this put together is one of the biggest causes of climate change. So this is the irony of our situation at present. So is there a solution? And in my opinion, for the sake of future generations, we should look at mitigation and not just resilience and adaptation. I think that is the need of the hour for all of us, scientists, policymakers. All of us have to come together. And is there a solution? So I want to quote from Bill Mollison. He said, "Though the problems of the world are increasingly complex, the solutions remain embarrassingly simple." Is this really true? Our experience shows that it is true. So, what is that simple solution? That solution is farming in harmony with nature, not farming against nature. And so, the community managed natural farming is a regenerative agriculture practice which mimics what is happening in nature. So, in natural farming, we believe that there is a complex ecosystem which consists of plants, roots, root exudates, soil biology, soil minerals, animals, human beings. And the source of energy is the sun, the solar energy, which through photosynthesis enables carbon from a gaseous stage to become liquid carbon, and that is driving life. Now, this balance has been disturbed very violently, especially over the last 70 years. So, therefore, it is in our hands to change the land management practices to be in harmony with nature. And this is what we have been attempting in Andhra Pradesh. So there are certain universal principles of natural farming which apply across the world. They're not, specific to India. They apply across the world, and these are very simple principles. One, soil to be covered with crops, the living root, because that is how the liquid carbon is getting into the soil. And we need diverse crops, not monocrops. Soil should not be disturbed. We should integrate animals into farming. Biostimulants as necessary catalysts because we have destroyed the soil biology below ground. So therefore, these are catalysts. And we should increase the crop residues, animal dung residues on the soil using indigenous seeds, pest management through non-chemical means. And this is an absolute principle: no synthetic fertilizers, no synthetic pesticides, herbicides, weedicides. So these 9 principles are, universal. What is unique to India, and that makes the transition smoother in India, is the traditionally used, uh, biostimulants, which are accelerating the process of reviving the biology below the ground. And they are in the form of microbial seed treatment, and then microbial soil enhancement, the Bijamrita, Jivamrita, the various Panchakavya, Dashaparni, various formulations which have come from farmers and have also been popularized by Sri Subhash Palekar. So this biostimulants is a very unique feature in Indian agriculture, which enables this transition to happen. But this is not a standalone feature. It is to be used in conjunction with all other principles of natural farming. And there is one very unique breakthrough we have achieved in Andhra Pradesh, which again has a very important bearing on climate change mitigation, is what we call as pre-monsoon dry sewing. I'll explain that in a subsequent slide. Now, this is what we have achieved in Andhra Pradesh in taking this technology to people. From 40,000 farmers in 2016-17, this year we'll be reaching 10 lakh farmers and farm workers, landless farm workers. So we would have reached out to 16% farmers. So now technology is one thing, taking to people is another technology. So the science is, the knowledge of natural farming is one thing, but more important according to me is how this knowledge is taken to people. And that is where, in Andhra Pradesh, we believe that there are 5 pillars. So first, of course, the role of government in promoting this, providing resources. Then there is one very unique principle that we followed on ground, that is knowledge dissemination through farmers themselves. So farmer to farmer extension. Then the other pillar at the grassroots level is the role of women collectives, women self-help groups. They are really the champions who are taking this forward. And then we believe that this requires hand-holding, long-term hand-holding, and that's where government and NGOs and farmers organizations have come together to provide this long hand-holding support to farmers making this transition. And of course, new knowledge, research is driving many of our interventions. So all of these have to go together to enable a technology to reach people and enable behavior change to happen, and thereby enable transformation to happen. And this is, the way our women self-help groups are planning, sharing knowledge, and learning and financing this change. Then in this slide, you can see the way our this lady, she's a master farmer, Sarojini Amma. So she's 70 plus. She's a master trainer, and farmers believe her. And then she helps them to do the transition. We also have young agriculture graduates to be embedded in the villages. So this knowledge dissemination innovation is very important, because then it's a two-way transfer, because she learns from farmers, she teaches farmers, and both of them are telling us something. So somewhere I think this science and technology, not as a linear one-way process, but as a dialogue, as a two-way process, becomes important in the dissemination process. And we have very strong place for science in driving our program. And as you can see, we have collaborations with FAO, UN, World Agroforestry, University of Reading, an Australian scientist, Walter Jena, CSTEP, CEW, the National Institutes. And we're doing research on a variety of things, socio-economic impact, what's happening to soils, water, biodiversity, etc. And the results from this experiment are feeding into our knowledge, and the questions from the field are then again taken back to the scientific institutions for a solution. So I believe that for us, science and knowledge has been very important in this revolution. What are the impacts? Now, this technology is ensuring that the farmers' economics have improved significantly, livelihoods have improved very significantly, costs of cultivation have come down. There is no particular yield penalty. In many cases, yields from natural farming are higher, and more important is better resilience, better soil health, crop health, etc. And we see very positive impact on health, especially of children. We see improved biodiversity, and you see this is a 2020 floods in October, November, and you can see neighboring fields. This is a paddy field. So after the water receded, the ZBNF plot, natural farming plot, is intact, whereas the chemically conventional plot is completely damaged. Again, neighboring fields, one is intact, the other is completely damaged. This is a cotton field. So one of the most important factors has been resilience to extreme weather events, and that is something which is really a blessing. Uh, then we had a innovation, as I mentioned. It's a unique initiative in the world. Uh, we learned from an Australian scientist that we can harness water from the air, and that is the strength of natural farming. We tried this experiment with 11 young agriculture graduates. We were successful, and this year we have more than 90,000 farmers who are driving this initiative. So what it offers is, even in semi-arid areas where even one crop is difficult, our farmers can actually take three crops. And this is drought tolerance, reversal of land degradation, reversal of desertification through this breakthrough in our understanding and adopting tweaking our natural farming practices. You can see this farmer in Anantapur. Earlier he would have taken only one crop, but now through natural farming is actually able to take three crops throughout the year. And this is by harnessing water from the air, as Walter Jena had formulated, and we learned from him. And you can see here the income of this farmer has more than doubled by this simple innovation. And this is a very, from 43,000 per annum, this farmer's income has gone to 107,000 rupees. This innovation is extremely important because what we understand, we are doing more research, that this can also lead to cooling of the planet. So this is the promise of this technology of harnessing water from the air, that we can actually cool the planet safely and by following principles of nature in a reasonable period of time. So I would like to conclude here, and await your questions.
So that was Mr. Vijay Kumar sharing his knowledge and his insights about this program and about climate change in general. So for all the questions that are there in the Q&A box, we will take it to the speaker and we'll find a way to give it back to the participants of this program. Thank you very much for joining us. Now over to Mr. Abhishek Nath for the next thematic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Indu. So we have now come to the third thematic discussion on energy. We'll try to cover power, industry, and mobility in this discussion. We are used to getting electricity at the switch of a button, and of course, my generation has seen days where power was not so easily available. At least in the smaller towns, there used to be power cuts and low voltages and things and problems like those. But the younger generation today, especially in bigger towns, the power situation has improved a lot. And over the last 3-4 decades, the situation has slowly but surely improved. In fact, we have now a situation where generating plants have to vie for ability to supply power to the discoms. So, to talk to us today on this subject, we have got Mr. Anil Sardana, who is the MD and CEO of Adani Transmission Limited, and also the MD of Adani Power since July 2020. Mr. Sardana is an electrical engineering graduate from Delhi College of Engineering. He started his career with central government NTPC plants and got into the private sector in 2002 as the ED of Tata Power Company. He was then at Delhi looking after NDPL, what was then called NDPL. For a brief period, he was with Tata Teleservices and later came back to Tata Power as the MD and CEO in 2011. As I have already said, currently he is the MD and CEO of Adani Transmission and the MD of Adani Power. So, Mr. Sadana, we have a lot to learn from you. As I said, you started your career in 1980 with NTPC, and so coming directly to some of the questions that we currently face today in the power sector. As I said before, today we are used to getting electricity supply at the switch of a button, and most of the large cities, the situation of power supply is very good. So, if we go back, I mean, I have also during my career I had a brief stint with CSC, and that was one of the companies which started city electrification in India way back in late 1890s. And today we have come to a situation where we are very close to electrifying each and every household in the country. So, Mr. Sardana, over your career span, where you have been in generation, you have been in transmission, you have been in distribution side, what would be, say, 2 or 3 most important technological changes that have occurred, which have led to the changing of this scenario?
So first and foremost, thank you, Abhishek, for having me over, and I apologize for the fact that the camera isn't showing me there, but I hope the voice will be clear to all. So you asked about the technology. I guess we are living in an era where we are all enamored with what we have seen technology do in terms of the way we have spent the last 1 year more than anything else. People have all actually operated out of their homes. People have been virtual, including this particular discussion is happening virtually. So it's been amazing in terms of what people have now encountered using technology. And the interesting part has been that, the electrons have been very important to everyone. People, when they get locked into situations like these, they need electricity to operate from home, to make sure that their life continues to be as normal as it could be. And I guess this period has shown that aspect very well to the people concerned. And in addition to that, see what's happening around us. Everything is now being talked in terms of IoT. Things are being talked in terms of artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality, data analytics, robotics, drones, so what not. I guess we are all living in an era where technology is overtaking every part of our life. So, and if I actually reflect back on 40 years of my career, one would say that what one has seen in terms of technology evolution in the last 40 years, perhaps one will see that in the next 4 years, far more than that. So, and similar has been the case in terms of how we have seen, IT changing our life, how email address. Earlier, people would talk your postal address, and now nobody talks about that. Everyone wants to see your email address. So I guess, these kind of questions, you actually have to go and introspect deeply, and then you realize that really technology has overtaken several parts of our life and the way we do things. So it's simply been amazing. And especially, I would say, when I started as the founding CEO and managing director of the Delhi distribution, which you mentioned about, and taking over from Livelihoods board, there were just about 2 computers, and they used to be 286 machines, that old machines, and they were also, typically covered with the plastic because they were like monuments and never used. And they were given to 2 chief engineers, and they used to don their cabins in terms of how they will decorate their cabins. And subsequent to that, you've seen the way things have evolved in terms of how technology has helped us to get not just reliability of supply, but the software services, interface with customers. And it just goes on in terms of how you can now use the data analytics to upsell and cross-sell several facilities to customers. So it's very, very, very fascinating times. Technology has really, really made a remarkable difference.
So you said the technology has changed a lot over the last 40 years, but you also said that it will change probably more in the next coming 4 years. The way, thinking of the pace at which technology has been changing, we have been used to, again, I'm repeating what I said earlier. We have been used to getting electricity supply at the switch of a button, but now with distributed RE generation, that is, just to introduce, we at CSTEP have been working a lot on uh, uh, rooftop solar applications, and we have done a large mapping exercise for the city of Bangalore, and we probably take it forward and try to see that things are better implemented in terms of having rooftop solar potential in Bangalore realized. So, do you also see, what changes will distributed generation bring in the consumer behavior, in the sense that people are now not only the users, the consumers, but also the generators and probably the storage people for electricity. So how do you think that scenario will change in terms of how tech savvy people have to be to be good consumers?
So Abhishek,
Yeah.
the the distributed generation is something that actually should have run amok amongst the urban texture of India, especially the ones which is not vertical in terms of its growth, but horizontal. And India is blessed with tremendous sun. We have a lot of potential for waste to energy in large complexes. Things could have been far, far different, but for the fact that, number one, our residential tariffs are artificially kept below the cost of supply. And that, therefore, to a large extent, forbids individual customers to adapt that as a solution. And therefore, you would find that the industries and the commercial establishments do adapt that because their tariffs are much above the cost of supply. So therefore, they find rooftop solar and many other options of distributed generation coming to their advantage. In the other context of residential customer, it could have really, really made a difference if there was that advantage, that customer tariff was also close to the cost of supply. The second factor which is there is that India adapted not the distributed generation model. We never adapted economy of scale advantage. India adapted to take bulk solar as the option. So therefore, you find we do 500 megawatt, 1000 megawatt. We talk about larger solar farms. And that's therefore detested people to look at the distributed generation option. I personally feel that over a period of time and over a few more years, perhaps one would have distributed generation really cling on to people's interest, and more people will adapt. And especially, I feel that waste to energy will be one big advantage that people will start to harness living in complexes and living in areas where that will also make sure that we don't therefore have the waste going to waste yards and heaps of the waste that you see around cities. So I think these two things will change over next 4 or 5 years. There'll be a number of incinerator facilities that will crop up. One would see generation of hydrogen, one would see methanol, several other derivatives that will start to come in, which will be used for several applications, which will become part of life.
Yeah, we as you said, we will see several more applications, several newer applications come to life. One that is actually coming to life in a very small way and perhaps has the potential to grow very fast is perhaps the mobility, the electric vehicles that we are talking about more and more these days. Uh, in fact, we are working with one government-owned local transport company, and trying to figure out uh, how we can help them. So, in your opinion, with coming of EVs, do you see major changes in how the transmission infrastructure will have to be upgraded? Transmission and distribution infrastructure will have to be upgraded to take care of the whole burden that transportation sector will put on the electric grid.
Yeah, so I think as a country we must acknowledge that electric mobility should have actually caught on much faster than it has done. In fact, we must realize that we are already late in it. There are countries, you clearly see Europe, China is another example where electric mobility is far more proliferated than what it has done in India. And it's for several factors which are not very difficult to understand. Number one, the cost of battery is disproportionate in the electric vehicles compared to the vehicles themselves, number one. Number two, some of the choices which the other countries like Europe could follow because of better mechanisms was the battery swapping, which in the Indian context somehow, because of the way we are, it's pretty tough and it's not worked therefore, and it hasn't given people the ease in terms of either taking the battery on lease options or using the battery swap options. These two things having not been handy in India, the other part is that you must therefore have fast charging stations, which are expensive, and therefore it will, and like it or not, India is a large geography. So of course China is also large. Europe wasn't, where small countries could therefore release the charging stations, and also the battery swapping was something which was available to people. These factors have detested us from really being successful in electric mobility. I still feel we are not over the hump. We still have a challenge, and the electric mobility therefore could still elude us for a few more years. Perhaps the 2025 could be the right time frame for us to cross the hump in the hockey stick, when it will then take off in a big way, and maybe the era between 25 and 30 could see higher proliferation than what we have seen now. So that's the scene like. As far as distribution infrastructure is concerned, I guess that's demand based, both from regulatory construct as well as consumer construct. The companies will really ramp up infrastructure related to electric vehicle charging stations once they say that there is demand. Today, it's like a chicken and egg story, which comes first. And that's the reason why you find in every city some, you can say it's like a fashion statement, some 20, 30 odd charging stations will mushroom, but they will hardly have any vehicles coming to them, and therefore they will stop there. And that's the kind of situation in which we are. But as a country, we must realize that we must do much more to support this cause, because one important aspect that, as a power person, I must state this, Abhishek, and you being also from the sector, and you are the one now who's seeing it from the other side of the table. When the pandemic set in from March onwards, one saw blue skies, one saw cleaner environment, one saw birds of the nature that you never saw in your neighborhood. You saw a tremendous amount of biodiversity aspects, which perhaps we never encountered on Mother Earth, or you could say we were deprived of seeing that. That existed, but that perhaps gave way to our material desires. But power stations ran. What did not run was the transport. What did not run was the industries. So I'm not trying to put one versus the other, but what I'm trying to say, if we get electric mobility, that perhaps will do a lot good to us, because then we would have simulated the situation as we saw during the pandemic state, where the transport which wasn't there helped us to have a cleaner environment. So I'm saying it from that point of view, not trying to put one versus the other, but also bringing the point that what pollutes more. And certainly in the city areas, construction industry and mobility are two major causes, and which we have to all be very, very therefore careful in terms of how we make it more benign in the times to come.
Thanks for pointing out this pandemic situation, because there is no doubt, I mean, the kind of blue skies we had at the start of the pandemic. Of course, with the sort of end of lockdown and starting of winters, at least in Delhi, the blue skies have been lost. But coming back to what we sort of started discussing about electricity, in India we have a large target of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by the year 2030. As far as and we did a couple of studies over the past 1 or 2 years where we saw that how, I mean, transmission was sometimes, not in some cases, proving to be a bottleneck for evacuation of RE power. What you already said, no doubt, that distribution companies will ramp up when the demand comes. But what about this 450 gigawatts by 2030? Do you think what strategy should be followed so that we have minimum bottlenecks in the transmission infrastructure to evacuate this power? What would be your views on that?
So, Abhishek, we all hope that we will see more and more transition and the energy formats which will be benign and gradually will therefore be the right solution for us as humanity. And we will only hope that even the storage systems in terms of battery or the hydro storage, pondage, all of those things will develop to a point that they become cost inexpensive. So those are certainly the hopes that we have. As regards the number part, whether it is 450 or we reach 400 or we reach 375, all of that is welcome. The limited point is that one should also see the demand growth. The important part is that the quality of life imperative in India has to improve. And I'm very concerned about the fact that, as a country, we haven't looked at one key factor, which Abhishek, in this forum, I would certainly want to mention, because that's one subject which is of my interest and research, that we have still 60 to 90 gigawatt of diesel generations as backup, which is donned by the industry. And sadly, this number comes from not the industry is declaring this, the number comes from PCRA, which we had to hire to do that study in terms of what oil gets into these DG sets to run as backup. Now, imagine in this country when we import most of the oil, and imagine where the pollution is one of the concerns that we have in our backyard. These kind of DG sets, and today 8,000 megawatt of DG set is still sold in this country. 4,000 megawatt as replacement sets and 4,000 megawatts of additional captive standby sets. How do we make sure that that is completely eliminated? How do we make sure that solar and wind completely displaces that? That is something which we have to, number one, assume that we get the benefit of that. Number two, which is important, is the distribution reliability. I think it's time that we hold accountable the distribution companies. I also run distribution company in Mumbai. Earlier, I ran the distribution company in Delhi. And I'm very conscious in making a responsible statement like this, that if the customer does not get electricity in the way we contract with the distribution company, the oil should be billed to the distribution company, because they must hold themselves accountable for the fact that the electrons have to be delivered 24/7. You could have some factor to say, I could have an allowance of 30 minutes in a month or whatever that you want to do as a part of contract, like we all do. But beyond that, why should industry bear what is non-core to them? And then we complain that these things cause harmful emissions. They sure will. But we are compelling them because somebody who's supposed to do his job is not doing it right. So I guess some of these factors is what we must address rather than only going on the supply side that the country needs 450 gigawatt of electricity. I'm saying country needs 24 into 7 electrons, and that too the most benign one.
Thank you, Mr. Sadana. On one part, you have accepted a challenge that if 450 gigawatts of RE has to come, the sector will be able to take care of it. On the other side, you have thrown us at CSTEP and probably in the civil society a challenge that we should also try to reduce the oil consumption that goes when the electricity supply is not there. So, Mr. Sadana, as I believe you also have engagement, I guess, just about to start. So it has been very kind of you to have been able to make it to this session, and we all thank you very much for this words of wisdom that you shared with us. We have only one more request, and that is some questions that will be posed. I mean, may have been posed during the session or will come up from CSTEP's own experts. We will try to send it to you and request your office if we can get some kind of a response on that, because this series of discussions, I mean the role of science and technology in society, this series of discussion we want to sort of carry on, not just as a one-time effort, but as a continuing discussion. So thank you, Mr. Sadana, once again, and thanks for being with us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, and thanks to all your participants. I'll certainly be happy to respond to those questions. Feel free to send that across to me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you.
So we have come to the end of the thematic session discussion 3 on energy. It is now over to Somali and to Jay. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Mr. Sardana. So with that, we come to the end of the thematic discussion. So we will now wrap up the entire discussion for this concluding session that we have now, which is more about what lies ahead. So to discuss that, we will have our Executive Director, Dr. Jaya Sundhi, in conversation with Mr. Atul Kanwar, who until recently was a technologist, now he leads an energy company, Hoka Energy. Hello, Atul. So we have Dr. Veena Srinivasan. So she works in the water space. She is a DATFI. She is the director for the Center for Social Environmental Innovation. And we have the funder's view or the philanthropist's view in through Mr. Rishikesh Pathsathy of Azim Premji Philanthropic Initiatives. He had strategy and programs there. So welcome all of you. So it's over to you now, Jay.
Good evening. I think it's almost getting to good night for many of us. And I think this is the nature of our times where we are sort of staying up later and later, right? And using more and more electrons that Mr. Anil Sardana was talking about. Let me jump in right away because we are running out of time. We should get into a good discussion here. So in this way forward session, I wanted to get together some 3 diverse views that will provide us some insights on what aspects we should focus on going ahead. I will try to, throw some very light questions to each of you. So I think let us start with maybe 5 minutes from each of you, where you could briefly state the area you're working on, but more importantly, focus on how science or technology is changing the way you work, right? How is it changing the way you work? How are you communicating to your key stakeholders? And how are the changing norms of technology, especially digital technology, changing the way we communicate to these stakeholders? So very briefly, which area you work, how science and technology is changing the way you work, and how is technology also changing the way you communicate with your stakeholders? So I will welcome Atul to go ahead. He's been listening in very carefully, I've noticed. So the floor is yours.
First and foremost, I guess this is a discussion that intrigued me when I was invited. And the reason for that was that while I'm not a scientist or a practitioner, nor am I a policy guy, I've been a business transformation person for years. And suddenly the pandemic actually provided an opportunity where one could try out some of the things that one had learned and done with organizations for corporate profit and see how it could impact and change things from the point of view of helping the scientific community. So that's my experience, and I thought maybe this would be a good opportunity to share some of the experiences and also talk in terms of that. So the way I work across, I guess, being in the IT sector all these years, working from home was always something that's there because it's 24/7 kind of a situation. So that is something one adapted a couple of years ago. So this was not a surprise from what came across right now and what technology provides. In fact, we've been in the forefront of doing those things. And I remember at one stage in Tech Mahindra when we did an entire world-wide conference on WebEx or Cisco's WebEx system that was there. Effectively, everyone was surprised, saying that you're eliminating the need to go and touch people and so on and so forth. But in a way of speaking, we figured out how to handle that bit. So that I don't think technology to that extent has impacted at least my UTEC working, but I see a lot of people around me. They've adapted and they are adapting to it even faster. And what has surprised me is the kind of people who are adapted to this technology. And the one that I really am amazed and impressed with is schools, and how schools have gone totally electronic, and how systems and solutions have come across for that. So that is one way. On communication, this has been something which is fairly significant, and I didn't realize the power of this till one started working across on the COVID area. Till now, I always thought of things like WhatsApp as things for social communication and so on and so forth. But how we leveraged WhatsApp in this period, both from the point of view of communicating with people working across the country and across the globe, actually, in different groups, which were interest groups, is something that was quite path-breaking. And, the problems that we were addressing and the kind of solutions and the feedback that was coming ranged from things like quantum computing to AI to running contests. It was very wide. And the power of what WhatsApp could do has surprised me. And what also surprised me on that side was how retailers in this pandemic, in the Indian context, the Kirana workers or the Kirana shops, took to WhatsApp in a very, very big way to be able to service their customers. So I think communication, and we extended this thing to how we work with the volunteers, because there was a big volunteer army in addition to what I'd call the PhD workforce that worked on a lot of initiatives under the aegis of the IIT Alumni Council. And again, it was something that was quite a revelation. And we tried other alternates, like we tried CRM systems, because a lot of people came to us and gave us their CRM systems and collaboration tools. But I must say that the one that's really stood out for me in this has been WhatsApp. So, I mean, that would be my initial angle, saying that, in this, what's coming through in the world right now is that Zoom's big. So people are really talking, or when I say Zoom, I mean all kinds of solutions around video related stuff. There is big collaboration, which is both in terms of systems as well as data that's happening across through platforms like WhatsApp, Telegram, etc. And then the third element very clearly is that increasingly a lot of focus was more on action, less to do with just meetings and discussions. So I think that those are the three things that the way how one communicates and works have changed.
Thank you. Thank you, Atul. Rishi, I will ask you to go next, because I know you did a lot of interesting things over this period of time, but I think you'll have a very interesting perspective. So I'll let you go next.
So hello to my fellow panelists and all the participants. And I'm probably going to take a slightly different view on this particular topic. And of course, I fully agree with Atul on the fundamental principle. We also think at the foundation, at the Azim Premji Foundation, that we live in a world where technology mediates almost everything. And I could completely endorse. I just was meeting an organization that runs 7 homeless shelters been around 3 of them, and I saw them running their entire operation on WhatsApp. The way the NGO works itself has changed so much, and WhatsApp is almost like their ERP for the shelter operations. Just here today. So given the technology mediates almost everything in the world today, I mean, I'm guessing this conversation is more about information technology. Just a couple of words of caution from our perspective, and it may sound strange coming from a funder. We do worry a bit about technology solutions that are removed from reality, and a lot of people coming in with applications that claim to solve a lot of the world's problems. So we're a bit cautious about that. I think any distance from ground realities, or actually the human social interactions that cause a lot of issues in society and are part of the solutions in society, tend to get ignored. So when we sort of look at work that's happening in tech, we are very careful, not to leave aside human and social interactions. Right? The second thing is that we see a lot of entrepreneurs, social enterprises, non-profits working in tech, not spending enough time on the ground as well in front of their stakeholders, whether it is civil society organizations or communities themselves. And as a foundation in this time, it's a bit odd. Of course, companies that need to stay at home should stay at home, but we've sort of also taken a decision that given the kind of partners that we support, it would be odd for us, for most of us, to hunker down at home. So we've been looking at the ground, looking at the kind of devastation this pandemic has caused among rural communities, among informal wage earners, migrant populations. It's quite stunning, actually, to get a view from the ground. So tech solutions, it's sort of, entrepreneurs stay closer to the ground and be engaged with the human aspect of solutions they're bringing, I think would be far more appreciated. With that, I would hand it back to you, Jay.
Thanks, Rishi. I think a cautionary tale, but something that we also heard from Uma earlier. So I think we have resonance there. Veena, I know you come from completely a different perspective, but I'm sure your perspective is nonetheless interesting. Please go ahead.
So I thought that since we have so many people talking about technology, maybe I'll talk a little more about science. And we, of course, I work for ATRI. It's a research institution. We work broadly in the areas of water, climate change, and biodiversity, although I myself work more in water. But recently, my role through the Center for Social and Environmental Innovation has very much changed from science to problem solving. So it's been a very interesting journey from that perspective of really shifting from what I would call more science to more communication and technology. Now, I think it's good to distinguish between science and technology, because I think science really, is defined, I would say, as a pursuit that involves settling of truth claims, right? Which is different from technology, which is really an application of science to solve or to address a particular societal problem. Now, I think that there's quite the way science is done and communicated has changed quite significantly in the last few years. And traditionally, I think a lot of scientists kind of thought of it as their job, as we kind of wrote a paper and then our communications officer maybe put it in the newspaper as a press release. And that was it. And if I was really, really, really adventurous, then I wrote a popular science piece. But that was it, right? And that was kind of the nature of scientific engagement. Now, obviously, with the increase in social media and the increased pressure, I would say also for scientists to directly engage through social media platforms, whether it's Twitter, whether it's LinkedIn, WhatsApp, whatever it may be, Facebook. I mean, I think that it's quite significantly changed the role, the pace, the way science is done completely. And I think there are several major shifts because of this. So the first one I would say is that when we did science before, and a lot of scientists still engage in this manner on Twitter, it's very much what I would call an inside-out view, which is I did this study and I wrote this paper and here's my result, which is very much kind of, this is my message to the world. It doesn't necessarily plug into an ongoing conversation. It's very different from the way social media actually requires you to engage, which is to converse with others on, conversations which are currently topical. And it's difficult for a lot of scientists to engage because that's not the time frame. So often when you're asked to settle a truth claim, you'd have to say, well, and we do it in the way we do science, which is with all the caveats, and then there's a statistical probability, but we need 4 more pieces of data, and that's kind of the nature of scientific the scientific process. But it's not the way popular communication occurs, and so scientists therefore are in this odd position where they have to communicate in a way and in a time frame that's not comfortable to them. But I think there was an interesting way that climate scientist Steve Schneider put it, and he called it science as a contact sport, which is that when you're in the public domain and you're communicating now with these very new, different digital ways of communicating, suddenly your role itself has moved from being an observer, which is an observer of society, an observer of the natural world, which is a role that scientists have traditionally been very comfortable with, to a participant in actually being able to influence and already actually changing that science society interface itself. And that's a much more complicated and a much more fraught kind of role. And I think a lot of scientists, myself and others, anybody who's been trolled about, even having said something really mild, finds that's been a big shift, I think, for a lot of scientists to shift to that role, and requires very, very different ways of thinking, very different skill sets, and I think a completely different way of viewing your own role in the science society interface. The only last bit I would add is, as everybody has already said, equity becomes an issue. Already, scientists never communicate in any other language and in completely esoteric fashion in any case. But I think social media does bias who you're having the conversation with even more, and or makes that much more obvious and apparent. And I think that is something that we all grapple with, knowing that on one hand we participate in this public conversation, on the other hand there's very few voices there. So I'll stop there for a moment and wait to hear from you.
Great. Thanks. I mean, that was a very different perspective, and it's very good to get even the science point of view. Now, in yesterday's discussion, there was this suggestion that that we should follow an engagement model. I mean, be it the scientists, and you did talk about it. I think there's also the technology. There's this engagement model instead of the educate model. I think the former, we used to always have the educate model, that the scientists will come out and announce to the world and tell the world what we do. Now, one question that I have is, what does that mean for your area of work? If you have to engage with the entities that you are working with, what does that mean? How will it change your internal processes? What will you have to change in your community, or in what we have to do when we have to get into this process? And I think there is also this, I'll just jump into the other question so you can just take it together. Is there this suggestion of having a recursive approach, right? Where once you're part of that engagement, there is this recursive approach. What does that mean for your respective area? So Atul, go ahead first.
Okay, so I think that's an interesting point you made in terms of both engagement and announcement kind of a thing. The big change that's happened across there is that now you're having a conversation with multiple stakeholders. Traditionally, science was just like Veena just mentioned. You went through a sequence of things. Time frames were larger and so on and so forth. Now you're having simultaneous conversations with multiple stakeholders. So that changes the entire paradigm. It's almost like, what happened in the field that I'm familiar with, which is IT, where we moved from what was called the waterfall methodology in the past, where you looked at what the final outcome was, defined all the things, made sure everything worked right, and you got it right first time, to a scenario which is more agile and, minimal viable product kind of a scenario, which we see today. Where you say that, okay, let me put whatever I have together, throw it out because I'll get feedback. And I've seen this work very, effectively in the COVID times. Let's look at the COVID scenario. Very quickly, the mapping of the genome happened. That was shared across the scientific community. In traditional times, and Veena would attune to this, it would have taken years maybe before it would have come out across. But here it came out in a matter of months and weeks. Then there were certain modifications that happened to that. That was again shared, discussed, debated. There were all kinds of results that were put into the public domain, which was being debated by scientists from across the world. And as a consequence of that, we started moving in different directions. And the first bio vaccine that we are talking about that came across from BioNTech, if you look at really what happened, it was a repurposing of a particular research. And that happened because all this thing was in public domain. People could take some calls, took decisions, and then subsequently, whatever the regulation as well as other methodologies followed through. So it's not to say you abandon one, but you're cutting down time. In my transformation language, we used to call this the difference between process time and the actual touch time. So the touch time is and the process time were two different things that used to be there. And the whole purpose used to be that if you knew how to reduce this gap, then you could transform an organization. And I think that's the thing that I'm starting to see in the scientific world. So I mean maybe
yeah,
if
no,
I
that's
could,
great.
if I could,
Yeah.
So
No, that's great. So Rishi, over to you to your thoughts on this.
No, I fully agree with Atul. I don't have too much to add. I think the way the world has responded to this COVID pandemic is an incredible response, truly incredible response. And, you know, a lot of times, you know, as funders, one of the key things we really look at in this particular aspect is application of mental models as well, right? Because we are generalists in some sense of the word. And a number of mental models that we sort of train our staff to look at is played out so well in this COVID pandemic too, right? And so I would not add much beyond agreeing with Atul and with Veena on how, you know, science has made an incredibly important difference in these times.
Veena, any thoughts on that perspective on this aspect of engagement rather than the educate model?
I mean, for sure, right? As both Atul and Rishikesh just pointed out, if you think about what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, and people use the analogy between climate change and COVID to basically see, you know, how quickly a major social problem was kind of researched and communicated, and then actually led to a masking, and you know, so much so that our grandmothers were able to use the word social distancing, right, and understood what the implication of social distancing was. And so, of course, that was a just an incredible feat in the science society interface. Personally, I would say when this, for me, I would call it an uncomfortable shift, because a part of it is because I've changed my role, and part of it is because the nature of our science communication has changed. But I think one major shift that I've seen that has occurred because of the recursive approach that you're talking about is the shift from informing to actually solving. And let me explain for a second. When we started a few years ago, kind of trying to think about how do you communicate water data, right? We thought, well, we'll just communicate data, and then people would just look at the data, and then that would make them change their behavior, right? And of course, that was stupid and naive. But what really then we realized that the things that people care about were not the things that we were telling them. In fact, they were asking questions to which we had no answers. And the reason is, and I still think that a lot of the science that needs to be done in order to actually solve the kinds of environmental crisis we have hasn't been done. And some of it's been done, but it's fragmented across, you know, different disciplines. And so I think the problem is that the nature of the scientific process, the way it's defined right now, which is targeted to peer-reviewed publications, kind of which inform theory in a particular domain, isn't necessarily what is required to generate solutions. And that, I think there's still a gap there. And I think for me at least, and that may be just my personal journey, has been that the nature of this recursion has meant also making the shift from thinking about just what I call looking back, which is why did X happen or why did Y happen, the way scientists kind of do the, you know, go through the process of inquiry, to how do I now do this better? And that's a very different journey. So I do think that when you move from a model of inform to engage, you actually do change the nature of the scientific pursuit itself.
So let me just do a
Small
follow-up.
thing. Sorry,
Go ahead, Atul, go.
Because Veena just triggered a thought in me, and Atul too, which is that this waterfall model, and you know, one of the mental models I spoke about was, you know, fail fast, fail quickly, and keep iterating. But beyond some of the big, really large bets that people made, right, on the vaccine front, or I don't think the world, and especially, you know, beyond the big government and business level, I don't think there's much freedom to fail. Right? Either it is problem of funding or investment, or it is the risks of failure. But one thing that really constrains us in terms of social change is, while we say failing fast is good and failure celebration of failure. There isn't really that much appetite for failure in many of the work that we do. And so that's something to think about. I know the world did it very well at the large vaccine level, taking forward calls and forward bets of hundreds of millions of dollars. But beyond that, I don't know if we see enough. Back to you,
If I
Jay.
could interject on that one, just to interject on that, I think I saw some additional elements which I thought may be relevant in the context of the comments both have made, both Veena and Rishikesh. One of the things that I saw was that when you brought in people from different fields together, there was really some kind of a catalyst effect that was happening towards changing things. And I'll give you a practical example on this. For we're all used to the RT-PCR test, for instance, on COVID. And if you really look at the origin of the RT-PCR test, it was done through cultures. It takes 8 hours. It does all that stuff. So no one was really looking at how to change this entire paradigm and to change it into something much, much faster. Now, a lot of that is feasible today because technology has evolved. So, for instance, there is no reason why today, given the cost of electron microscope linked magnification is available at low cost. And when I say low cost, we are talking about sub 10 lakhs and sub 5 lakh rupees kind of a thing, that you can actually not see the virus in a sample. I mean, I could take a blood spot and I could actually see the virus today. So there is no reason why not to apply some of these newer techniques rather than do the traditional method of culture. Now, this culture methodology has been there for 50 years, 60 years. It's proven, it does very well, but then you have to experiment with new things. So when we started pushing people towards that, we are actually seeing a lot of outcomes starting to come across. Similar thing was this whole thing about, I don't know if you've caught this thing, this thing called Oxford nanopore. So this is a simple material because of nanotechnology that's come across, where if you pass something across, you can have different size of holes. It's like the games we used to play in the past, and different particles go into it, and you can actually figure out what to do. So nanopore was doing this. Then we came across with a modification of that and said, why can't I check resistance or impedance of this thing? And it changes the entire complexion of the game. So I think what really is happening with this communication is that other people are challenging existing fields. And I've seen scientists react very positively to it. And they've gone back and said, yeah, why can't we do this? Why can't we do that kind of a thing? And my own appreciation of science has really gone up in this period because, I used to, I come from the school of the MBAs and all that stuff, and we have this thing, and outcome is this, and this is what it is, and everything is, kind of put in spreadsheets. And here's a realm which is not about spreadsheets. It's about exploring really pure stuff, and there's joy, and there's fun, and there's learning. But at the same time, you can take it into different directions, and you can say that if something's been discovered somewhere else, you can do that. And I'll end with just one example of where we use technology to, there was this startup, and I wouldn't want to name it, and we were trying to run an AI contest. And we realized that this entire thing that they were doing, I mean, this is a very major field. This is about diagnosis using X-rays and lungs, etc., and all. And they were really faking it because there was no real AI that was working across on it. So, kind of a thing. So you could actually call these out because you were subjecting a lot of things to peer reviews, and that's how this knowledge came across. So I think this communication element will really grow going forward. Scientists are finding it useful. We did find some gaps also, for instance, especially in the government committees, where you have scientists from different CSIR labs and DRDOs. It was crazy when they come together. When you talk to them individually, it's brilliant. But when you bring them together into a committee, then everyone's thinking of a report as opposed to, the outcome and the impact, as Veena was just mentioning right now. So yeah, I mean, nonetheless, it's very exciting times, is what I can say.
Since you have the mic, the proverbial mic, let me ask the final question of the panel. I mean, we have to wrap up soon. The question to you is, how do you see, as an organizational transformer, how should you see civil society? What are the lessons to civil society that you would want to give so that they can be more effective? If I were to use, and I think that's down your ballpark. So give me say three things to do.
I think they should be concern and participation. That's one. And I call it the volunteer workforce kind of a thing. And that's one part. The second thing is that, if I was to look at it, there should be funding availability which expands. And quite honestly, when we started looking at it, it looked like they were limited things. But by the time, these 9 months, there's so many funding opportunities. So if you're really doing something, once realize that funds are not a joke at all. It's available from different sources, right from foundations on one side to corporates through CSR to government grants to various things. You really need to solve the problem. And the third thing is that we need to support science in a big way, not just technology, which is the application, as Veena rightly pointed out, because basic science is going to make the difference. There's so much progress that's happened, but a lot of it has not seen the day of light today. And I think society needs to support, and policy think tanks need to support the application or the utilization of that scientific research into solving problems, including problems we've solved. We can solve them better. Is the way I would put it across. So those would be the key ones from my point of view.
Thanks so much, Atul. I'll just tell you that you're going to get a lot of emails in your mailbox now for funding of science. So with that, I will go to Veena.
Well, there are nine sources I've identified, so hopefully there'll be lots and lots of things. Nine different.
But you're the MBA with the investor and all that, so you have to be now putting your money where your mouth is. So that's very good. Veena, what would you tell the young scientist coming up? A person has just finished their PhD, they're doing their first postdoc. What advice would you give them in this changing world?
I would say three things. One is to try and stretch outside your paradigm, whatever you've been taught, because most often the answers and the really brilliant breakthroughs come from outside your whatever you've been taught, because whatever you've been taught, you've already learned. The second thing I would say is really invest in communication. You can never go wrong in being able to communicate better with a whole variety of people. The third I would say is understand your role in the science society interface and exactly where it is that the levels that you can access lie. So those are my.
Fantastic. I think my researchers have to use that mantra completely. So Rishi, I obviously have left the last for you, and it's not a trick question, but we talk about all these great things. As much as Atul says there's a lot of money, I think Veena and I will talk about how difficult it is to raise grants for the kind of work that we want to do. Now, how do you build this risk appetite in the kinds of funding community? I mean, you talk to each other. How do we build this risk appetite? As you said, take risks, get more engaged. How do we do that? The floor is yours.
It's a hard question, and I'm conscious of who's on my panel as I say this. I think I could just say one view that we take is we generally have preference for people on the ground in the field. I'm talking about the philanthropy grants. University and research grants are a totally different matter. So I was sort of going to answer your original question to Atul and Veena. So I'll try to answer that and this in a way. One is spend more time on the community on the ground. We have a very strong preference for supporting organizations or people who are making an immediate sort of viable difference to lives on the ground. Immediate is secondary, but ground connected viable. That's a second. And I think a third one is just an appreciation for the nuances of human and social interactions, right? Which are related to the technology and the science that gets implemented on the ground. So those are some of the things that we might look at.
Thank you so much. I think we pretty much have utilized all our time. I have kept all of you awake, away from dinner, away from families. But I think it was a great discussion. As I mentioned at the start of this particular series, is that we are just trying to get this conversation going. This is not a once in a year event. We're planning to have this more often. We want to get more people often, and I will definitely invite you guys now for probably an in-depth discussion that we might have later on during the course of the year. We might do it with other institutions too, be it educational institutions or other civil society organizations, and go thematic, because I think it is important that we talk about specific themes and talk to also people on the ground as much as possible. So that is something that I definitely want to do. So I must thank Atul, Rishi, Dr. Veena, thank you very much for being part of this discussion. I look forward to interacting with you over the coming days, maybe as we set up the series and we take this forward. So thank you very much. Audience, if you have any questions, please send it to us. We will forward it, just like I think we're going to create this massive data bank where questions to all the panelist members and hopefully an answer, because it would be great to archive these answers too. I don't think it's something that we should lose. This is knowledge that that we definitely have and we should definitely keep up. So thank you very much, and thank you, audience, for this. Let me take this final 5 minutes to give a vote of thanks to all the people that have participated. Thank you, of course, to the various speakers, Dr. Suresh Prabhu to start off with, and then we had Kiran Karnik, we had Professor Jasanoff, and we also had Mr. Shashi Kumar on the first day. Of course, the session chaired by Dr. V.K. Atre, a good advisor of ours. On the second day, we had all the thematic discussions where we discussed different themes. And I think we have set the stage for a discussion, more detail in the days to come. I must also thank the CSTEP team, led ably by Shumali Moitra, who leads the communication group at CSTEP, and he's the Vice President of Communications, and also all the people behind the scenes. Neha Sharma, you also had her team, as well as Shiva Sandeep and the IT team that put together IT, made sure most of the IT things work. I think the biggest heartache we all have is whether the IT system will work and we'll be able to hear each other, see each other. So thank you very much. I hope we will continue this discussion and continue this dialogue, and hope to see you all very soon. So thank you very much and have a good night.